the truths were contradictory. It can be argued, for instance, that war is grotesque, but in truth, war is also beautiful. I can still remember walking quietly in solitude every evening, watching as the darkness faded into the first moments of light. One morning when I was walking in the shade of the trees, amidst the thickening mud near the camp, I felt a little pull on my uniform. As I looked down, I saw the speckled light of the canopy glistening off the dusty face of a little Vietnamese boy. I didn't say a word, nor did he. But as I walked, he followed a few steps behind me all the way home. It was a comfortable silence. I can still remember emerging from the pathway and seeing the way that the filtered sunlight was freckled across Kurt Lemon's face as he laughed underneath the marquee of trees. I can still see him turning, looking back at his friend. Then he took that curious half step from the shade into the sunlight. They were just goofing, tossing an innocent smoke grenade back and forth in an attempt to amuse themselves. Shouldn't have happened. But it did. As his foot touched the sunlit ground, his face was suddenly shining and brown. It was a rigged 105 round. If I could ever get the story right, how the beautiful sunlight seemed to enclose around him and lift him high up into a tree of vines and white blossoms. If I could somehow find the words to describe the deadly whiteness of the light. I can still remember thinking about the awful majesty of warfare. The tracer rounds unwinding through the dark like brilliant red ribbons. The fluid symmetries of troop on the move. The harmonies of sound, shape, and proportion. It's not pretty exactly. It's entrancing. Like any bomb or battle or artillery barrage, has the aesthetic purity of absolute moral indifference. A powerful, implacable beauty. And a true war story will tell you the truth about this, though the truth is ugly. And but in the end, of course, a war story isn't even really about the war. It's about sunlight. It's about the shadows, the way that the particles of ember glint in the morning light. I can still remember that morning. The light, his face, the little boy, still following me now. That is my creative. In Tim O'Brien's novel, The Things They Carried, the chapter spin consists of unconnected anecdotes delivered in scattered phrases and half-realized memories. Stylistically, this jarring structure echoes the fragmentation of the war experience, as well as the unpredictable nature of violence. While in themselves, the anecdotes are static and self-contained, they're all seemingly unrelated and jump about in time, purpose, and magnitude, much like a soldier's mind might jump about around his past. Through the use of authorical reticence, Tim O'Brien engages the reader in the reality of each of these narratives, as well as allows the reader to make their own judgments and personalize it for themselves. Such lucid dreams and shell-shocked wonderings of the veteran's mind are further heightened by the semi-frantic tone used in many of the anecdotes within this chapter, such as the last paragraph in this chapter, in which the memories are delivered in short and unconnected sentences. Throughout this chapter, it is evident that the weight of the stories that Tim O'Brien is telling originate from a fragment of his memory. A shift in tone accompanies the fragmentation as he transitions from a balanced to a disillusioned evaluation of the war. He suggests that the war consisted of perfect madness, juxtaposed with he suggests that the war was perfect madness and consisted of men witnessing appalling acts juxtaposed with random moments of kindness and serenity. This is shown in the beginning of the chapter as one of the soldiers, Azar, gives a little boy with a plastic leg a piece of chocolate. At first, Tim O'Brien makes the reader believe that the soldier, Azar, actually did care for the little boy. However, this thought is shattered as he goes on to say that some poor soldier just ran out of ammo before finishing the boy off. This jarring form allows the reader to feel the psychological effects of the war in distorting one's perception of good and bad. Through the use of spin doctoring in describing the war, Tim O'Brien seems to indicate that while spin doctoring usually makes the ugly seem beautiful, that there was in fact beauty within the ugliness of war. This is emphasized when Tim O'Brien thrice describes the brown and shining face before death of another soldier. In addition, in another dimension, there was another twist on the spin in that throughout the Vietnam War, the soldiers were exposed to things that they had never seen before and didn't know how to handle. Although the chapter spin has a fairly straightforward plot, the splintered narratives further develop the characters who appear throughout the entirety of the things they carry. In this chapter, Tim O'Brien allows the reader to feel the aggressive boredom of war by describing the things that happened when nothing was happening, such as morning walks. It is through these fragmented moments that Tim O'Brien defines the inner conflicts and thoughts of many of the primary characters as shown in my performance. And in addition, for example, the dimness of Norman Boker, the immature inhumanity of Azar, and the thoughtful emotional grounding of Kiowa. In addition, such anecdotes induce a visceral response, which is why I chose to do a theater performance, which allows the reader to further understand the context and setting of the narrative. In this chapter, Tim O'Brien recollects the first of several fragments or vignettes of the narrative of the death of another one of the soldiers in his platoon, Kurt Lemon. In this preliminary introduction of the character of Kurt Lemon, Tim O'Brien describes the grotesque death through the use of light imagery. Tim O'Brien creates a very unsettling tone by co-locating an account of an appalling act of man with the beauty and beautiful aesthetics of light and nature. In my performance, what I initially was going to do was have a single spotlight to light the action, while the rest of the stage is in darkness. This was to emphasize this concept of light and dark, good and bad being placed side by side. While at first the purposely narrow description of the death of Kurt Lemon may seem to originate from a polite respect of the situation, it seems as if Tim O'Brien is actually struggling with a much larger emotional barrier when writing this narrative. It is the barrier of how to carry and make sense of the memories that followed the soldiers home, much like the little boy who was always a few steps behind him. In the moment, Tim O'Brien seems to suggest that dishonesty to oneself is one of the ways that many of the men, including himself, chose to deal with fright, uncertainty, and devastation. However, it is evident in his writing that the heavy reality of the memories were the things that the soldiers still carried on their way home and after the war. Throughout the entirety of the novel, The Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien continues to use the subtle motif of light in the unnerving narrative of Kurt Lemon's death, perhaps to distance himself from the whole reality of the situation. In my dramatic soliloquy, done from the perspective of Tim O'Brien, I have further explored the presented metaphor of the color palette within the electromagnetic spectrum of light. Throughout the narrative of Kurt Lemon's death, Tim O'Brien presents a variety of colors, including sickly nuclear white, which represents the sicknesses in the trenches, shells dropping and flashing in the background, artillery dust brooding browns, which represent uncertainty, fear, limited visibility, and total annihilation of even ground, and ghostly static yellow, which represents the fallout from constant bombardment and explosions, and the sunlight which would then rise to show the carnage left. Within this chapter, Tim O'Brien seems to suggest that war is much like the visible light spectrum, and that it corresponds to the spectrum of experiences created by the war. Both in the chapter spin and my dramatic performance, Tim O'Brien's recollections originate from a variety of situations and emotions, including mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness